Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Danny, episode number 269. Thank you for taking the time to join me on this next episode. So today I want to just share some observations. I think they are, I guess, both maybe practical and also, things to consider. And I'll just title this A Man, a Land, a People. And as I was reading in Genesis, just kind of been making my way through the book of Genesis again, I came across a part, and I might have touched on this in the past, but it's something that's been sticking out to me, and I just want to kind of pass that on. In Genesis chapter 35, verse 10, we find Jacob returning from Padan Aram, and God appears to him and blesses him. And in verse 10, it says, God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. Now, there's other things happening, I think, here. The name Jacob, that carries a certain meaning. I think if I'm not mistaken, maybe in Hebrew it means heel grabber, or actually here in this footnote it says Jacob means he grasps the heel. It's a Hebrew idiom for he deceives. And in this name or renaming, the word Israel probably means he struggles with God. So there's some other dynamics or some other maybe revelations you could get from this name change, this re-identification. As we become followers of Christ, our identities change, and who we were is left behind. Who we have become in Christ becomes new. We become a new person. It's a kind of a renaming, if you will. So there is that dynamic happening in the midst of this. But there's another observation that I make inside of this part of the story. So God says to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. So here we have a man, Jacob, who becomes named Israel. And from him, we know that the nation of Israel is born. And this is obviously over generations and generations and generations, and even into the more what we would consider kind of modern, but beyond the lineage of Jacob. He's a father of Israel, who himself is renamed by God Israel. Well, so we have a man who is named or renamed, and we also call the land, or the name of the land is Israel. So this man, Jacob, who is called now Israel, he's a man, and his name also represents a land, and his name also represents a people. So there's really this kind of three-pronged dynamic that's happening inside of his name. And we'll also kind of differently look at Genesis chapter 10 and verse 6. This is just describing the different the sons of the of certain fathers, genealogies, and verse 6 gives us the sons of Ham. Now, if you recall in the story with Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you may recall the story after the flood when Noah, who was a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard after the flood. And he drank some of its wine, and he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. You may remember that Ham was the father of Caanan, and he saw his father, this is Ham, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But his other brothers, Shem and Japheth, they took a garment, laid it across their shoulders, walked backward, and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned so they did not see their father's nakedness. But when Noah awoke from his wine, and he found out what his youngest son had done to him, that's fascinating, he said, "Cursed be Caanan." Well, that's some strong words. And I wonder, it's just a thought, I wonder if we were more cautious with what we said or more thoughtful about what we said, how that would change the trajectory of things. First of all, Caanan, he didn't do what had happened to him. You'd think he would say, "Cursed be Ham," but he cursed Caanan, which was the son of the one who had done this to him. So now, if you have any kind of, if you studied the Bible, you're likely to recall the story of the Canaanites being a very, significant part of the struggle dynamic between Israel and the Canaanites. And there's, land discrepancies and ownerships, authorities, the wars, all kinds of issues. And I just wonder if Noah had been more cautious in what he said, in the cursing that he identified, if that could have changed anything within the dynamic of these people groups. So I think this is something for us to be mindful of. And Noah, he was responsible for the choices that he made, and he made some bad ones. Specifically, getting drunk, laying naked, and really kind of putting himself in a very bad situation. And so I just wonder if he had been more cautious with what he proclaimed, what he declared, what he concluded, if that could have changed trajectory. I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. But sorry, I slightly digressed there. Cursed be Caanan, he says. And we'll see also in verse 15, chapter 10, Caanan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and Hamathites. Later, the Canaanite clans scattered. Okay, so we see all of these families born of Canaan, and you'll recall in many of the Old Testament books where these wars and battles and God gives the land over to Israel that is being occupied by the clans of many of the different ites, as we just read. So there's a very complicated dynamic, we'll say, in these people. But as it relates to our discussion here of a man, a land, a people, we notice there also, just like it happened with Jacob, who became renamed as Israel. Israel was a man. He's representative of a land, and he's representative of a people. Similarly, Caanan is also a man. He is representative of a land, Canaan land. We hear about this. Remember when Joshua and the spies, and they go over to look at the country. We have gospel songs, Canaan land, this land flowing with milk and honey, and so Canaan land, and also the Canaanites. This is a people. So Caanan is also a man, a land, and a people. Well, we see, so I identify this as, this is interesting. We have two men representing a land and a people. What are the implications of that? Why is this the case, and what's inside of that revelation? Well, I see kind of a parallel in a New Testament story that is in John chapter 6. You may be familiar with Jesus and his feeding of the 5,000 men, but it's John chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and this great crowd of people followed him. And Jesus goes up the mountainside. He sits down with his disciples. And Jesus sees the people, and they saw this great crowd coming. And Jesus says to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?' And he did this, though, to test Philip, because he already knew what he wanted or had in mind to do. Well, another of the disciples, Andrew, spoke up and said, 'Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but how far will this go among so many people?' And Jesus says, 'Have the people sit down.' So, as you know the story probably, Jesus took these loaves, the fishes, he gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. After they had all they needed to eat, he said to the disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over so nothing is wasted.'" Okay, so following this idea of a man, a land, a people, here in this story, we have a boy, and give me a little freedom here, but we have a boy, a fish, and a feeding. Yes, he has more than one fish, and he also has bread, but, some liberty here. We have a boy, a fish, or some fish, and some feeding. I kind of see a play happening here. It's not a direct example, but I think it captures an essence of something that we're seeing occur in these Old Testament stories in Genesis. Now, I think there's some specific things that we can draw from the, Jacob, Israel, and Canaan and Canaanites revelation. We can draw some specific things out from that direct relationship there. But I think the essence also of that playing into this, a boy, a fish, and a feeding, I think it also grabs a hold of an essence of some things that we can conclude from these types of realities. So what is that? Well, I think it's a few things that I believe to be important to remember. And number one, I believe that it magnifies God's ability to take nothing and make it something. Here in all three of these cases, you have a single person. It's a we find in the progression of Jacob's story, there's even instances where he has foreign gods in his household and among some of his wives and servants. So there's a point where Jacob has a lot of even pagan roots inside of his I guess sphere, we'll call it. So he at some point in his life, Abraham even is drawn out of a pagan people. So there could be a lot of carryover inside of the culture, the family, and that kind of gets flushed out over the years. So, the person, Jacob, he's a singular man. And then you have Caanan, who goes on to be the father of many nations or different peoples. And we know these through the story of the Bible. Many of these nations are very wicked and very pagan. And God is I guess pointing towards the time when judgment would be pronounced upon their evil and wickedness, and that's a very complex dynamic. But even someone will call Jacob, for just the sake of the analogy, as the becoming righteous. He is becoming more righteous in terms of his devotion to God, we'll say that. And then we see Caanan, who not sure about his allegiances and where he stands, but we do know that from his line comes those who would be more evil and wicked and choosing their own desires over God's. So we see the opposite, let's say, end of the spectrum, perhaps, in that reality. And then in the New Testament example, we have a boy, just a boy, probably not looked at as, contributing to society, probably very overlooked and very marginalized. This was a society, no doubt, where men were the focal point of society, and women and children were pretty low on the societal scale. So it shows this. I see in this, the very, what we would consider the very righteous side, and what we may consider the unrighteous people, and then what we'd even consider the marginalized and overlooked. We see all of those spectrums and spheres, and in those spheres of, we'll call it influence, but in those spheres, we see God's ability to magnify, to his ability to produce something from literally or absolutely nothing, of insignificance to significance. So it just reminds us of his ability. And then number two, what does this show? It shows God's progression, and it gives us vision for how He may work in our lives. And so progression, it shows God's progression and gives us vision. What do I mean by that? Well, it starts with a man, and then we see a man in a land, and the multiplication of that man in the land, producing a people. So it's very progressive. The story doesn't start from a man and then into a people. There is an order to it. Now, that's not to say that God is limited to doing things in a practical order. God can do whatever He wishes in any way He wishes. So we're not going to pin Him down to this is the way God does this. So that's important to remember. But in terms of approaching the dynamic of these stories, we can see a progression. We can see a practicality, and we can see kind of this linear movement within the paradigms of how it relates to, I guess, a relation to practicality, but not bound to our concepts of what is practical. So it shows us God's progression, and then in that it can give us a vision for how God may work in our lives. So that's important. And then the third thing is, I think it may speak to the timing of God's work. Like I said, before you can have a people, you need a man. Before you can have, when you have a man and a people, well, where are these people going to be? So there's a necessity of land. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have land in terms of literal land. It could be different. Jesus said, go into all the nation, into Jerusalem, Judea, to the ends of the earth. There is a expansion of this idea of land. It could be something as simple within your home, and go from there. So it's not necessarily, to be a part of God's story, you need some, parcel of land. We should think a little. We should think more bigger. We should think bigger or larger in terms of, God's not confined or limited to any way or process. But we see, though, inside of these stories, there is a timing. And I think many of us have experienced something along this lines in terms of what God's doing or wanting to do in our lives. There is a timing to it. No matter how hard I try to produce something that even godly, there is a God's timing to it that I struggle with still, years later after, giving myself to God. There is, that struggle of God's appointed time, and I think we see that, throughout Scripture is God's timing. So I think these stories, the boy, he shows up when he was supposed to. He has this lunch with him when he is supposed to. God's hand of sovereignty is in the midst of all of these stories, whether they are stories that we, understand, or stories that, we can't possibly see or imagine how, God might be involved in it, or even sovereignly arranging things within that story, within that context. So these are all good reminders of how God's timing in His work, and God is He's a very practical God. He's very reasonable, and so these are all these are all important realities, I think, to recall. God's able to take nothing and make it something, and God's progression in our lives, in how we impact other people's lives, in how He is weaving in His story. God's progression gives us a vision for how He may work in our lives and other people's lives, and then God's timing is important to remember. So I think all of these things are something that I kind of gain insight from within these stories and how they relate. So hopefully that just gives you, maybe an appreciation for, how the different interweavings of the biblical narrative, how they can be kind of practically felt within our lives and our Christian journey. And maybe you find yourself listening to this and you have not given yourself to Jesus. I would encourage you to do so. The fact that you are here is no accident. God has orchestrated this moment for you, and so it's as simple as acknowledging your insufficiency and acknowledging His sufficiency. And in doing that, and giving yourself to Him, you can become His. And it's so simple that we've overcomplicated it too much inside of Christendom. So I would encourage you, speak to Him, talk to Him, and acknowledge your insufficiency and acknowledge His superiority, and give yourself to Him. Become His and enter into the family of God, because God is a Father, and we are His family. It's very different and unique inside of different religions, and we have a relationship with our Father and His Son Jesus Christ, who He has sent for the forgiveness of sins, as we all sin and fall short. So I hope this informs. I hope it excites you to Scripture and the complexity of what is available in it, but also the simplicity of how this can affect and impact our own lives. So thank you for being with me. I appreciate you and look forward to the next one. God bless.